Today is Friday, May 29th, 2026, and right now as you are watching this video, the world is balanced on a razor's edge. Within the last 48 hours, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, launched a direct missile strike against a United States military airbase, and the Pentagon is scrambling to contain the fallout. Donald Trump is in the White House Situation Room this very morning, making what his own team is calling a final determination about the fate of a deal with Tehran. And at the exact same moment, on the other side of the planet, a chilling intelligence warning is circulating in Moscow. Russia's own FSB, the successor to the KGB, is quietly telling the Kremlin that China has its eyes on Siberia, not just economically, strategically, territorially. Two seismic stories, one devastating week, and both of them point to the same conclusion. The old world order is crumbling faster than any government wants to admit publicly. Let's start with what happened at the airbase, because the details are shocking. On the morning of May 28th, the IRGC fired on the American military installation they identified as the source of U.S. strikes on Bandar Abbas, a strategic Iranian port city near the Strait of Hormuz. In their official statement, Iran said, following this morning's aggression by the invading U.S. military against a location on the outskirts of Bandar Abbas airport using aerial projectiles, the American airbase that served as the source of the attack was targeted at 4:50 a.m. Then came the words that need to echo in every foreign policy capital on earth. This response is a serious warning to the enemy that any act of aggression will not go unanswered, and if repeated, our response will be even more decisive. Simultaneously, Kuwait's military announced that its air defenses were responding to what they officially called hostile missile and drone threats, but stopped short of naming the origin. The UAE's foreign ministry called the escalation a flagrant violation of the sovereignty of Kuwait and a threat to its security and stability. Now here is what the American side says happened just hours before Iran launched. U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, intercepted 5 Iranian one-way attack drones near the Strait of Hormuz, and the N struck a ground control station in Bandar Abbas that was preparing to launch a 6th. The U.S. called these actions measured, purely defensive, and intended to maintain the ceasefire. Iran called them aggression. Iran retaliated. And just like that, a ceasefire that the entire diplomatic world had been carefully tending to for weeks was shaking violently. Struck, Trump sat in a cabinet meeting on Wednesday, May 27th, and publicly declared that Iran was negotiating on fumes. He rejected an Iranian state TV report suggesting a draft deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz was nearly finished. He dismissed it publicly and immediately. And then Iran, furious, launched. Never have a nuclear weapon or bomb. The Hormuz Strait must be immediately open. No tolls for unrestricted shipping traffic in both directions. All water mines, if any, will be terminated. That is the demand. But the question hanging over every trading floor and every military base in the Middle East right now is, will Iran comply? Or will this escalate into something that makes everything we have already witnessed look like a warm-up? Let's put this strike in the context of how far this conflict has already traveled. The timeline begins on February 28th, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched joint strikes on Iranian military targets, including what multiple reports described as the assassination of Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. Iran's response was almost immediate. The IRGC closed the Strait of Hormuz to all foreign shipping, sending shockwaves through global oil markets. Then came the waves, wave after wave after wave of Iranian ballistic missiles and drones targeting American positions across the Middle East. U.S. bases in Bahrain, Saudis, Arabia's Prince Sultan Air Base, UAE installations, British facilities in Cyprus, and even the remote joint US-UK base at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean were targeted. By late March, the IRGC was announcing its 78th wave of retaliatory strikes, using IMED and Qadr ballistic missiles and combat drones. At least 16 U.S. military installations across the region sustained significant damage. One American soldier, a 26-year-old from Kentucky, was killed at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. And now, even after a fragile ceasefire was announced in April, this war has flared up 3 times. 3 times since the ceasefire. And the 3rd time happened this week, this morning. Here is what the Pentagon does not want on the front page of every newspaper. Iran has not just been firing missiles blindly, it has been fighting a calculated, intelligent, deeply strategic war against American infrastructure in the Middle East, and winning rounds that Washington is reluctant to acknowledge publicly. Defense security analysts who reviewed satellite imagery and battlefield forensics in the aftermath of the early 2026 strikes reached a devastating conclusion. Iran's targeting methodology was deliberately focused on what they described as high-value, low-redundancy assets. That is military language for, they went after the things that are hardest to replace and most critical to American operations. Specifically, Iran targeted AN/TPY-2 missile defense radars. These are the backbone of America and early warning systems in the region. They targeted satellite communications infrastructure, the systems that keep American command and control connected across thousands of miles. And they targeted airborne early warning aircraft, the flying command posts that give the U.S. military its situational picture from above. The pattern was not random anger, it was doctrine. Iran was trying to blind the American military, to degrade its ability to see incoming threats, to coordinate responses, to integrate its layered air defense systems. And, according to multiple investigative reports, Iran had significant help doing this. Iran used a Chinese spy satellite to monitor U.S. bases, according to the Financial Times, allowing Tehran to obtain high-resolution imagery of American positions and calibrate its strike coordinates with a degree of precision that stunned U.S. commanders. On top of that, Russia reportedly provided Iran with real-time intelligence on the location and movement of U.S. forces and assets across the Middle East. Russia, the country that lectures the world about the sanctity of sovereignty, was feeding targeting data to Iran as American soldiers ran for cover. This is the new military reality that the United States now faces. And Trump, to his credit, has not blinked. Operation Epic Fury, the American countermeasure, sank Iran's largest naval vessels, degraded Iran's air defense network, and eliminated many of the Islamic Republic's top military commanders. CENTCOM Chairman General Dan Kane stood at a Pentagon podium in late April and laid out those achievements. But analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies immediately noted the other side of that ledger. The U.S. had also discovered, in the most painful possible way, just how vulnerable its forward deployed forces in the Middle East truly are to a sophisticated, sustained missile and drone campaign. Thousands of drones and missiles were fired at U.S. bases and host nations during 6 weeks of heavy combat. American radar systems, aircraft hangars, warehouses, and command centers took sustained fire. The damage forced one of the largest movements of military families in recent history. The Pentagon rushed to evacuate dependents and non-essential personnel from multiple locations as airspace closed and explosions continued. The ceasefire, when it finally arrived in April, was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of exhaustion on both sides. And now the ceasefire is fraying. What happened on Thursday, May 28th, was already there. The third direct military exchange since the ceasefire was announced. U.S. and Iranian negotiators reportedly believed they were close to a broader deal, a memorandum of understanding that would see the Strait of Hormuz fully reopened over 60 days, with Iran loosening its grip on the waterway in synchronized steps with a U.S. withdrawal of its naval blockade. 2 U.S. officials confirmed to ABC News that both sides had reached a draft agreement, but Trump had not signed off. And until Trump signs off, there is no deal. Meanwhile, on the Iranian side, Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated Ali Khamenei who rose to power, have rejected deals at the final stage of negotiations before. Both have every domestic political incentive to look tough, and both have militaries that are, right now, shooting at each other. The economic damage running in parallel to the military conflict is staggering. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of global oil trade, since Iran closed it in late February, and then imposed controlled bureaucratic access through IRGC naval coordination, turbulence. Iran's own economy, already weakened by Western sanctions, already groaning under the weight of domestic unrest and protests that were put down with force earlier this year, is bleeding. But Iran's leadership has made a calculated bet that they can outlast Trump's appetite for a prolonged conflict. Directly on Wednesday, that the upcoming November midterm elections in the United States will not rush him into a bad deal. Iran is negotiating on fumes, he said. The IRGC heard those words, and the next morning they fired on an American airbase. This is what diplomacy looks like when it collapses in slow motion, in real time, in public, with missiles as the punctuation marks. Now, pivot from the flames of the Persian Gulf to the frozen forests of Siberia, because what is quietly unfolding on Russia's eastern border may be the most consequential slow motion. Power shift of our generation, and Russia's own spy agency is the one sounding the alarm. The Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, the FSB, the feared domestic intelligence apparatus that emerged from the ashes of the Soviet KGB, has produced an internal document that reads like a geopolitical horror story for the Kremlin. A classified 8-page planning memo, obtained and verified by the New York Times through intelligence officials from 6 Western countries, contains a conclusion that would have been unthinkable to state publicly in Moscow just 3 years ago. A previously undisclosed FSB unit classified China as their word, the enemy. Not a competitor, not a challenge, the enemy. And it described the intelligence battle between Russia and China as tense and dynamically developing. Let that sink in for a moment. Vladimir Putin has spent the last 4 years publicly proclaiming a no-limits partnership with Xi Jinping. He has met with the Chinese leader more than 40 times. He has deepened economic ties, energy contracts, and military coordination in ways that have only accelerated since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And yet, inside the Lubyanka, the FSB headquarters in Moscow, Chinese officials are being called the enemy, and Russian counterintelligence officers are raising alarm bells about what Beijing is doing in Russia's east. What exactly is China doing? According to the FSB document, Chinese intelligence operatives are actively targeting Russian scientists, defense officials, and research institutions to extract sensitive military technology, including drone warfare tactic S and Russian-developed countermeasures against Western weapon systems. China is reportedly using polygraph tests on agents returning from Russia. It has tightened surveillance over the 20,000 Russian students currently studying in Chinese universities, treating them as potential intelligence assets. It has attempted to recruit Russians married to Chinese spouses. And according to the FSB, Chinese intelligence services have been conducting espionage operations in the Arctic, Russia's strategic crown jewel that Putin considers critical to the country's long-term power projection. But the most explosive warning in the FSB document relates to Siberia and Russia's Far East. Intelligence officers have explicitly flagged that Chinese scientists and operatives appear to be preparing grounds to claim Russian territory. The document highlights a 2,615-mile shared border between the two nations, once a flashpoint for armed military clashes in the late 1960s, and points to the deep historical fault lines underneath the current diplomatic surface. Chinese nationalists have for decades openly challenged the 19th century treaties under which Russia acquired vast territories from China. The Treaty of Aigen in 1858 and the Convention of Peking in 1860 are not ancient, forgotten documents in Beijing's cultural memory. They are wounds, and the FSB believes China has not forgotten them. The geography makes Russia's vulnerability stark. The Russian Far East is an astonishing 6.9 million square kilometers, nearly the size of the continental United States. And yet it is home to only 8.3 million people, a population density of roughly 2 people per square kilometer in some areas. Directly across the border, China's Heilongjiang province alone has a population of 31.85 million people, with a population density of 70 people per square kilometer. The demographic imbalance is not just a statistic. It is a strategic reality that military planners in both Moscow and Beijing understand acutely. The Russian Far East contains 40% of Russian territory and some of the most resource-rich land on Earth. Vast natural gas fields, mineral wealth, Arctic access, and Pacific coastline. And China, increasingly cut off from Western energy markets, is eyeing exactly those resources. China's strategy, analysts have noted, is not necessarily the kind of military annexation we might imagine from a 20th century playbook. It is subtler, more patient, more dangerous. Beijing has been purchasing agricultural land and securing decades-long leases near the Russian-Chinese border, a move that echoes the gradual, informal assertion of influence China has used along its border with India and in the South China Sea. In 2023, China's Ministry of Natural Resources released an updated official map that depicted certain Russian territories with Chinese place names, and in some cases as Chinese land. When confronted about this, Chinese diplomats maintained that China and Russia have no territorial claims against each other. But the map said something different. And now, Chinese officials openly use the Siberian city of Vladivostok's historic Chinese name, Haishenwai, not as a cultural gesture, as a statement. The FSB document illuminates the depth of Moscow's internal anxiety about all of this. Russia is deeply dependent on China economically after Western sanctions following Ukraine. The Power of Siberia pipeline, already operational, and the long-delayed Power of Siberia 2 pipeline project represent energy deals that bind Russia to China in ways that give Beijing enormous leverage. And Beijing knows it. There's a thread that runs through the burning skies above the Strait of Hormuz and the frozen steppes of Siberia. It is the thread of a world order that was built after World War II, reinforced after the Cold War, and is now coming apart at the seams. And the events of this week, today, Friday, May 29th, 2026, are not isolated news stories. They are symptoms of a structural collapse that has been building for years. Consider the position Vladimir Putin finds himself in right now. He launched a war in Ukraine that was supposed to take days and has consumed years. It has bled Russia's military capacity, cratered its economy under Western sanctions, and driven it into the arms of Beijing, an embrace that Putin chose, and that his own intelligence service is now telling him carries mortal risks. A recent defector from Russia's inner circles, a former Kremlin-linked Gazprom Bank vice president named Igor Volobuev, who took up arms with Ukraine, made a statement about Putin's most recent visit to Xi Jinping that has been quietly circulating in intelligence and diplomatic circles. He described the Russian president as weakened and dependent. He pointed specifically to the failure of Russia and China to finalize the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline deal, a project Beijing has repeatedly slowed down while demanding favorable pricing and terms. The message that failure sends is clear. China is not in a hurry. China knows Russia needs the deal more than China does. And when you need something more than the other side does, you have already lost the negotiation. Meanwhile, underneath the diplomatic theater of the No Limits Partnership, the FSB is watching Chinese nationals drift into Siberian border regions with a level of frequency and purpose that goes beyond tourism. Chinese investment into the Russian Far East, which Moscow welcomed desperately after Western sanctions, has created economic footholds that intelligence officers describe as potential long-term vectors of influence. The history of China's strategy in contested spaces, from the South China Sea to the Himalayas to the Arctic, follows a consistent pattern. Establish economic presence, normalize that. The FSB sees this playbook being run in Siberia and the Russian Far East. And the tragedy for Putin is that he has no good options. He cannot publicly confront China without destroying the economic lifeline that is keeping his war machine operational. He cannot ignore the threat without allowing it to deepen. And he cannot reassert military control over the Far East. His army is committed in Ukraine, stretched thin, and fighting a war that has already cost Russia far more than any Kremlin projection ever anticipated. Now bring this back to Iran and America. The United States, right now on the morning of May 29th, 2026, has Trump in the situation room. The president posted on social media just hours ago laying out his bottom lines for Iran. No nuclear weapon, no tolls on the ally, straight, no mines. Those demands, if met, would represent a historic American victory and a crushing defeat for the Islamic Republic. But Iran has been fighting precisely because it knows that accepting American terms now, after the killing of its supreme leader and the destruction of its nuclear program, would look like surrender to its own population, a population that was already protesting in the streets before this war even started. The deal being negotiated, a memorandum of understanding to reopen the Strait of Hormuz gradually over 60 days, would give Iran a face-saving off-ramp. Oman and Qatar, playing the roles of quiet intermediaries, have been critical to keeping the back channel alive, but every time the deal gets close, something blows up. Literally, the U.S. strikes drones near Bandar Abbas, Iran fires back at an American base, Kuwait scrambles its air official, put it on Thursday. It is always a little messy. That is a remarkable understatement for a conflict that has already killed Americans, displaced military families, shut down global shipping routes, and rattled energy markets worldwide. What today, May 29th, 2026 represents is a convergence of crises that no single power can resolve alone. The United States is discovering the limits of forward-deployed military presence in an age of precision missiles and Chinese surveillance satellites. Russia is discovering that feeding Iran intelligence while depending on China economically is a game where the chess pieces keep changing sides, and China, patient, watching, quietly leasing farmland along the Amur River and renaming Russian cities on government maps, is playing a completely different game than everyone else at the table. The question for the world is not whether Iran and the United States will eventually reach a deal. They probably will. The question is what the planet looks like on the other side of this conflict, and whether the architects of that post-war order will wake up in time to see that the most dangerous player in the room has been preparing for decades, while everyone else was distracted by the fires they set themselves. Your paycheck is about to get smaller, not because of a pay cut, not because of inflation, but because of a tax bomb that's been ticking since 2017, and it's set to explode in exactly 341 days. If you earn between $50,000 and $400,000 a year, this affects you, and most people have no idea it's coming. In 2017, something changed in the tax code that gave millions of Americans a temporary break. The key word here is temporary. That break expires on December 31st, 2025. When the clock strikes midnight on New Year's Eve, your tax bill could jump by thousands of dollars, maybe even tens of thousands, depending on your income. But here's the thing. The people who know about this are already taking action. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what they're doing and how you can do it too. Let me paint you a picture. It's April 2027. You're sitting at your kitchen table, staring at your tax return, and something doesn't add up. You made roughly the career ladder you were promised. It's being dismantled, right now, from the bottom up. And here's the uncomfortable truth nobody's telling you. AI isn't coming for the CEO's job. It's coming for yours. If you're starting your career or planning to, the ground beneath you is shifting faster than anyone wants to admit. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why entry-level positions are the first to go, and more importantly, what you can do about it before it's too late. Let's talk about the elimination that's already happening. The pattern is clear. Look at what's happening right now across industries. Customer service roles? ChatGPT and AI chatbots handle thousands of inquiries simultaneously. Junior copywriters? AI generates product descriptions, social media posts, and email campaigns in seconds. Data entry clerks? Automated systems extract, organize, and input information without breaks or errors. This isn't AF. California just lost 75,000 residents in a single year. But here's what nobody's talking about. They're not scattering randomly across America. They're moving to 5 specific states, and the pattern reveals something massive about the future of this country. I analyzed the migration data, and what I found will change how you think about where Americans actually want to live. For decades, California was the promised land, the golden state, where dreams came true and fortunes were made. But something fundamental has shifted. For the first time in over a century, more people are leaving California than moving in. And we're not talking about a few thousand people. We're talking about a mass exodus that rivals the Dust Bowl migration, except this time it's happening in reverse. The question everyone's asking is, where are they going? And more importantly, why those places? Because the data tells a story that politicians don't want you to hear. Let's